Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about the film Spider-Man 2 from 2004. Most superhero sequels deal with the effects of the first film. The first superhero film is always obviously an origin story, and most of that film is hindered by the fact that you have to set up these characters, that you have to set up this origin, this mythos with this character so that you can go on to make a franchise, theoretically. The second film is always kind of usually can be a lot better because you're not hindered by the fact that you have to do certain things. So Spider-Man can get bitten by the radioactive spider and meet Harry Osborn and set up Mary Jane and all this nonsense. Also, I think the second film can get more into the existential dilemma of that character. And although other superhero films had done that before Spider-Man 2, like Superman 2, which actually was kind of an influence on Sam Raimi when he decided to make Spider-Man 2, although the storyline is actually from the comic books, question his powers, question his ability to be a superhero, and have him question the responsibility, the burden, what it actually does to his family and what it does to his life. He's not making any money being Spider-Man. He's a vigilante and he's not being paid. He's doing it out of the goodness of his heart, but it's risking his relationships. He's late for everything. He gets fired from his job. Peter Parker can't really hold down much of anything, and he starts to regret being Spider-Man. And in Superman 2, I think the difference of that being that he mainly gave it up to be with Lois, whereas Spider-Man 2, he gives it up not just because of Mary Jane, also because of school and his job, and his relationships with anyone are basically risked because he's always dashing away to be Spider-Man. I always really like this film because it really kind of embodies the Spider-Man character more than any Spider-Man movie ever has. It's more about the Spider-Man character almost than even Doc Ock, although they establish Doc Ock very well in this film, and he's very well played by Alfred Molina. But whereas most sequels, especially superhero sequels, become more and more about the villain, Spider-Man 2 doesn't. In fact, I think it spends more time with Peter Parker in this film than we probably did in the first Spider-Man movie. It's almost kind of a character study in a way. It's like kind of a mainstream big Hollywood character study, but it's definitely a character study because you really get to know him, really feel for him. And I almost was surprised how emotional I get, even though I've seen this film tons and tons of times. I'm always surprised how involved I get into the relationship of Peter Parker and his relationship with his own character of Spider-Man, and how he feels like he can't do this anymore, or how he's obligated to do it, or how he needs to do it, and the real morals behind being a hero. This film, I think, gets more into the morals behind being a superhero than any superhero movie I've ever seen. That he would kind of give this up not to be, a cool party animal, or to be really kind of, selfish in the typical sense, but to be better at school and to actually be able to afford his rent. Certainly he does do it for MJ as well. It almost has this sense of growing up. Peter Parker had grown up. He was in college at this point. You see him kind of dealing with this idea, like, does he want to keep doing this? Does he want to give up Spider-Man completely? One of the reasons I always gravitate towards this Spider-Man film, and it's one of my favorite superhero movies of all time, just because I love what it represents about the character, and that it's just a good Spider-Man story. That they made a very good Spider-Man movie that isn't just about his origin, which I actually kind of like the first film, but this film is just so phenomenal, and that it is funnier than the last film. The special effects are a giant leap forward. It's darker, funnier, scarier. It's a complete improvement over the last film. I remember people talking about having its screenplay nominated for Best Screenplay at the Oscars that year. It actually won Best Visual Effects. And Spider-Man 2 land on some pretty big top 10 lists of the year, and it really is that good. Peter Parker slowly losing his Spider-Man powers while being stressed out about his financial situation, Aunt May's financial situation, and not doing as well in school. And then he's also doing a report, and James Franco's character of Harry Osborn introduces him to Dr. Otto Octavius. Otto Octavius goes on to become Doc Ock after a failed experiment and is the villain of the film. The real thing Peter Parker has to deal with this time is his own powers and getting them back after being stressed out and not sure what to do. He slowly loses his powers until he can gain confidence back and save the day and defeat Doc Ock. It's probably my favorite big-budget Sam Raimi film, particularly because of the sense of humor. It's very, very funny, actually. From the Bruce Campbell cameo to the raindrops are falling on my head, to him getting hit in the face with a book bag, which was actually carried by Sam Raimi. I actually like how funny this movie really is, and I think it makes it that more relatable, and makes this film so great is that it can do kind of these darker, more serious moments with him and MJ and him dealing with his powers, but it still can be an entertaining popcorn film. And whereas most superhero sequels, especially like Iron Man 2 for example, basically chokes on having too many villains, too many plot lines, too many things going on, this film doesn't really expand on the universe enough where you can really get lost in having too many characters. When you have Doc Ock, he's not a bigger part of the movie than Peter Parker. Same with James Franco and his whole Harry Osborn thing and the MJ stuff. It all feels like it was given as much attention as last time, and that it's kind of continuing the story but evolving the story also. When I first saw this film, it was 2004. It was a big summer for me because I was in college, and the first summer of my freshman to sophomore year I went home, but that was the only summer I went home from college. The next summer, with the summer this film came out, I stayed in New York and I found a place and I had a roommate, and I was so excited to see this film, and I was just so in awe that someone had made a good Spider-Man movie, as good as this was. It was like, comic book movies can't get better than this. And I remember seeing it with my friend Tom at a pretty terrible screening, but it was fun. These two kids kept yelling out the whole time, and then they threw something and this big black guy stood up and goes, "Shut the fuck up!" And these kids like were quiet after that because he was scary. I wish he had said it sooner though. I think because this film is so much about growing older and responsibility, but also there was a sense I always felt about 2004 between this film and The Incredibles and the third Harry Potter movie, that you could get a great director, let him do a blockbuster movie, and he wouldn't completely sell out and do as many concessions to the studio. He'd still make a really great movie. And I felt like blockbuster filmmaking in the 90s just couldn't really do that unless you were a huge director. And to have people like Sam Raimi, Alfonso Cuarón, and Brad Bird, who previous to these films, I could not imagine a studio letting them have as much free reign as they did. Spider-Man 2 basically happened because the studio had more faith in them because of the first Spider-Man. And they ended up making a very great movie because of Sam Raimi's love for Spider-Man and getting that Spider-Man's a fun character. I think a lot of the color tones and the color palette he did and made with the first Spider-Man film and he set was later used in the existing Marvel universe. Now that was obviously from the comic books, so I don't know how much credit you could technically give him. But this film is shot very well by one of my favorite cinematographers working today, Bill Pope, and he does those amazing tracking shots, which obviously are very computer generated, but where the camera, you see it zooming and then it comes out of Doc Ock's sunglasses, these crazy tracking shots, and the fluidity in this film of those shots is absolutely stunning still. And some of the action sequences in this film, I feel like the first film, it feels often like Power Rangers. In Spider-Man 2, it doesn't at all. The sense of fluidity to it in the action sequences are so amazing, and it definitely feels like a Spider-Man fight, you know, on top of those buildings with Doc Ock. The acting in this film is also very good. I think it'll be a long time before we see an actor who embodies Peter Parker as well as Tobey Maguire. He just perfectly is Peter Parker. He's dorky, he's nerdy, he can do all the big action sequences, he can do the wisecracks of Spider-Man, and he can do the character that we all grew up with in the comic books perfectly. It felt like he was born to play Peter Parker. And I think this is his best performance as Peter Parker in the three films. James Franco, I remember when I saw this, I was surprised how good he was in this film actually. And it was one of the first times I really started to think of him as an actor, although I liked him in Freaks and Geeks. And I thought he was good in that, but I started to go, wow, he could really be in the movies. Little did I know, Alfred Molina as Doc Ock. Physically, he reminds me of what Doc Ock should look like, but he's just so amazing at that part. He has kind of a theatricality to it, like a classic movie villainness that I really like. It almost feels like a classic Hollywood Doc Ock. Even the way he speaks, it sounds like he's a very stage actor, which he is. I think he was doing Fiddler on the Roof around the time this came out, and he has a very theatricality to that performance, which I like. It's very different from Spider-Man, but it's kind of like an older, kind of more theater actor versus more of a film actor, which kind of works for him both being his mentor and the villain in the film. J.K. Simmons is J. Jonah Jameson. I mean, he just steals the show. That part where he's like, "Boss, your wife lost her checkbook." He's like, "Thanks for the good news." That's still my favorite J.K. Simmons role. He's so amazing in that performance. It feels like I'm watching J. Jonah Jameson on screen. There's a lot of people in this film who just felt like they were straight out of the comic book. And I really love that about this film. I understand doing a different adaptation, and I'm all for that actually, if it's done well, but I think this film really embodied that dream of a Spider-Man movie that I always had, and J.K. Simmons brought that even more alive for me. Kirsten Dunst, I've never really liked her in this movie, and I think partially because she's probably the worst cast of this franchise. I don't really think she can play Mary Jane. The whole idea of Mary Jane Watson in the comic book is that she's this gorgeous model, and that when she walks in a room, everyone's like, va 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 voom, and everybody loves her. She's this famous model actress. And I get that when they were making the first Spider-Man, Kirsten Dunst's star was on the rise. I guess she had a good agent or something. She's fine as her version of Mary Jane, but she's not really Mary Jane. I know there was that whole recent thing with Shailene Woodley, and people were very sexist to her about her performance, but not that I agree with the shitty things they said about her. I don't think that kind of a person should really play Mary J. Watson. I think it should be someone who everyone's like, how did Peter Parker get her, kind of a thing. And Kirsten Dunst is fine. I just don't think she was really playing Mary Jane from the comic book. She was playing this version for 2004. I don't really like Kirsten Dunst that much in general. I'm okay with her in the film, but I just don't feel like she was a good choice to play Mary Jane. She was fine in the role. She's not so horrible she ruins the movie, and she works pretty well with Tobey Maguire, but I kind of wish they'd gone for the Mary Jane we all know and love from the comic books, but I still feel like the movies have yet to have done that, because I don't think Shailene Woodley's really a good choice either. But I think that criticism should apply to Kirsten Dunst as well. If you're going to criticize Shailene Woodley, just do it a lot nicer and less sexist. This film is actually really about the acting, and that's one thing I think a lot of superhero and big budget movies go wrong, is you can have amazing special effects, but if the acting suffers, it's kind of all you have. And this film is so much of a character piece, you really could, I mean, I don't think you should, but I think you could skip the action sequences and just be about these character pieces, and it still work fairly well. It embodies the character of Spider-Man. It is a Spider-Man story brought to life. I just remember people going like, hey, this isn't just a good comic book movie. And when people were just starting to get sick of superhero movies starting, this is the first one that showed you can do better stories in the sequels after you do the origin. And it goes more into the with great power becomes great responsibility. And I think Peter Parker was starting to feel the great responsibility that was beholding him, and how it was holding him back from having a real life. And I think that goes more with the character, that I like this film and I like this dilemma more than the one in Superman 2, because it just feels such a natural one that you would eventually kind of think about, maybe I should give it up. When he comes back, it feels so triumphant. I remember feeling so happy that such a good superhero movie and such a good blockbuster could come out and be as good as it is. I love what Sam Raimi did with that character. I love the fun to it. I love the flow of Spider-Man 2. It just has a good energy to it that you can both watch as a lover of film and someone who likes Spider-Man, that it just works better than most big blockbuster movies of that decade. Sometimes I watch this film and I just remember being in that summer, my first kind of summer without school, on my own. Wow, future's gonna be pretty cool. And now that they make movies like Spider-Man 2, just think of the future of comic book movies is going to be after this. Oh man, I can't wait for Spider-Man 3. There's no way that can go wrong. So if you have seen Spider-Man 2 and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to.